8. Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares. A young college student named Faith Hedgepeth was beaten to death on September 7, 2012 in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. The 19-year-old was a member of Warren County's Halawa-Saponi tribal community, a tribe from the state's northeast Piedmont region. The murder left people utterly shaken. But over the years, the local police and other investigative teams released details regarding Faith's death to try and generate leads for solving the cold case. In 2016, detectives revealed that they'd finished a computer-generated photo composite of a suspect based on DNA evidence from the crime scene. That DNA was then cross-referenced with 229 different samples to rule out other suspects. And according to police, this led investigators to a 28-year-old man named Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares. On September 16, 2021, 9 years after Faith was murdered, the killer was finally caught. Unfortunately, not too much was known about Salguero Olivares, which is why he wasn't initially a suspect in Faith's murder case. But once his DNA was linked, he was arrested and booked into Durham County Detention Center without bond. He's currently facing a first-degree murder charge. A motion was filed on September 28, 2021 by Durham County District Attorney Satana Debris' office, seeking a non-capital punishment for Salguero Olivares' alleged crimes. At the moment, it's unclear if the case will be tried in Superior Court. 7. Joseph Michael Simpson. The body of a young woman was discovered by a rancher and his son on December 16, 1995, in Wasatch County, Utah, during a hunting trip. The victim was naked and covered in blood, lying on top of rocks near the banks of the Provo River. The rancher immediately reported what they'd found. One of the first investigators to get there was Detective Todd Bonner, who saw that the woman's skull was crushed. He claimed it was possible that she may have received her injuries from one of the rocks found near her body. Several of the rocks were collected by crime scene technicians, just in case one of them was the murder weapon. A single pair of neatly folded socks were also located nearby, which was the only other piece of physical evidence near the scene. There was initially no clear indication as to who the young woman was or how she died. But an autopsy proved that the cause of death was blunt force trauma, and it was determined that she'd been killed 10 to 12 hours before her body was found. This placed the woman's time of death at 9 p.m. on Friday, December 15th. Unfortunately for investigators, the only clues to her identity were 3 tattoos, one of which was the name Chris written above her left breast, and a ring on her finger. Meanwhile, a young man from Salt Lake City named Chris was looking for his girlfriend. He reported to police that his partner Tracy Beslanowicz had gone for a walk to get some food at 2 a.m. on the day investigators believe she was killed. When Tracy never came back to the couple's motel room, Chris got worried and reported her missing. He identified Tracy after recognizing the victim's tattoos. But when the girl's father was called, police were shocked when he said Jane Doe was not his daughter, but most likely his stepdaughter, Crystal, a sex worker who apparently had a habit of using Tracy's identity. With a more accurate name for the victim, police searched diligently for the killer. But years passed and the case eventually went cold. It wasn't reopened until 2006, and still it took another 7 years for the murderer to be identified. In July 2013, a DNA test was done on 2 of the rocks found near Crystal's body, placing 46-year-old Joseph Michael Simpson at the scene of the crime. Simpson was apparently an ex-convict who happened to be out on parole when Crystal was killed. In the end, he was found guilty of murder after a jury spent 3 hours deliberating. On September 30th, 2016, he was sentenced to life behind bars. He's currently serving his time at the Central Utah Correctional Facility. 6. Raymond Samuels. Unfortunately, when the unnatural death of a homeless person happens, there's not much attention put into finding the killer. But this wasn't the case with 49-year-old Sarah Lynn Wineski, who in 2005 was found strangled to death in St. Petersburg, Florida. According to 10 News on May 21st of that year, screams were heard by witnesses at 11 p.m. But the woman's body wasn't discovered until the next afternoon. Wineski's remains were underneath a deck behind a Ronald McDonald house. DNA evidence was collected from the scene of the crime, but the case wasn't solved until November 2013. The DNA belonged to a 31-year-old man named Raymond Samuels, who'd been incarcerated in Ohio since 2006 for kidnapping and attempted murder. Investigators concluded that Samuels, who was also homeless, had been in the area when Wineski was murdered. And on January 24, 2017, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in connection to Wineski's case. 5. Hector Bencomo Hinojos. The Denver District Attorney's Office reached a significant benchmark in the summer of 2013 when they cracked Patricia Beard's 1981 cold case. The 32-year-old woman was found dead on the first floor of her apartment building. She was in her home, lying face up on her bed with an open robe. Her underwear was wrapped around her ankle and her slip was pushed up. There was also a used tampon nearby, suggesting that Beard had no plans to get intimate. When an autopsy was carried out, lacerations on the victim's left breast were found, and she had extensive hemorrhages and a bone fracture along her neck. The coroner ultimately concluded that she had been brutally strangled to death. The original officers working on the case noted that the killer probably made his way into the woman's apartment through a window. But even though the cause of death and point of entry were determined, the murderer's identity wasn't until July 2013. The Denver Police Department's cold case unit apparently found a post-mortem kit affiliated with Beard's case in August 2011, sparking a new effort to find her killer. Inside the kit was a vaginal swab that tested positive for sperm. And so, a detective ordered the sample to be tested for DNA. Then, on July 11, 2013, a DNA match was determined and Hector Bencomo Hinojos was taken into custody. The suspect was found easily by investigators at a prison in Loretto, Pennsylvania. He initially denied knowing the victim, but when the man's wife was questioned about his character, she said he was physically abusive. She also identified 6 different occasions where he came home with stolen goods, suggesting that he'd been involved in burglaries and similar crimes around the time Beard was killed. This evidence fit perfectly with the suspect's mode of entry into the victim's apartment, giving officers and prosecutors confidence that Hector Bencomo Hinojos was responsible for the murder. In the end, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping in connection to the death of Patricia Beard. As a result, he was given 48 years behind bars. 4. Matthew John Beck. In 1998, a 10-year-old girl named Anna Palmer was killed in Salt Lake City, Utah. The case was cold for 11 years until finally getting solved in 2009. According to Anna's mother, Nancy Palmer, her daughter had many friends, and on the night of her disappearance, she'd asked if she could have a play date with one of them. Nancy didn't have a problem with this, but she told Anna to tell her when she'd be coming home. Then, that same night at about 7 p.m., Nancy found her daughter on the front porch of their house. She was cold and pale, prompting her mother to dial 911. Even though emergency responders came within minutes of the call, it was too late, and Anna was pronounced dead at the scene. The little girl had a hole in her throat and had been stabbed several times, on top of other physical trauma. The friend Anna visited was interviewed, and she told investigators that when they were walking to the corner of the street, they noticed a man following them. Apparently, this man was also seen by another 14-year-old who witnessed the girls walking home that day. Unfortunately, despite the information collected on the day of Anna's murder, there wasn't enough for investigators to work with, and the case went cold. But in 2009, Anna's death was re-examined. By then, forensic technology was available, and samples from the girls' fingerprints were sent to the lab to be tested for DNA. Miraculously, the sample identified the murder suspect, a man named Matthew John Beck, who was only 19 years old when Anna was killed. The man was found by detectives in an Idaho prison where he'd been serving time for sodomy. He was charged with the crime, and in 2011, Beck pleaded guilty to murder. For the gruesome slaying of 10-year-old Anna Palmer, Beck was sentenced to life in prison without parole. 3. Donna Perry, aka Douglas Perry. Within a 4-month period in 1990, 3 women, 38-year-old Kathy Brisbois, 34-year-old Nikki Lowe, and 26-year-old Yolanda Sapp, were shot to death in Spokane, Washington. The women's bodies were discarded like trash near the banks of the Spokane River. According to Deputy Prosecutor Sharon Headland, their remains were apparently either left completely naked by the killer or with their genitals and breasts exposed. All 3 of them had been involved in sex work, which may be the reason why the case wasn't solved until 22 years later. Until 2012, the women were believed to be victims of the serial killer Robert L. Yates. But when Donna Perry, formerly known as Douglas Perry, was convicted of a firearms possession charge in March of that year, her DNA was submitted into the National Crime Database. It turned out that she was a perfect match for the DNA collected from the women murdered in 1990. And so, in 2014, Donna, who completed her gender reassignment surgery in Thailand back in 2000, was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. On July 24, 2017, Donna was finally found guilty. As punishment, the trans woman was consequently handed 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. 2. Hank Wise. A 19-year-old woman named Stacy Chahorsky was killed in Georgia, and her murder wasn't solved until 2022. Stacy's body was found along the highway in Dade County, not too far away from the Alabama-Georgia border. For the past 33 years, not much was known about the case, including her identity and the identity of the killer. But now, decades later, Stacy's family is getting answers thanks to new genealogy DNA testing. Ken Farley, an FBI Atlanta special agent, broke the news to the woman's loved ones in September 2022. He released a statement to the public stating, "We are standing here today, almost 34 years later, to say we have finally identified Stacy Chahorsky's killer. The man in question, Hank Wise, was the killer. Apparently, the man's DNA was matched to one of his living family members. When he was alive, Wise worked as a truck driver whose route went through the Southeast. His DNA was collected at the crime scene, and he had a criminal history in Florida, North Carolina, and Georgia, where Stacy was killed." Joe Montgomery, a special agent with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, personally spoke with the victim's mother to tell her they'd identified her daughter's killer. Detectives confirmed that Wise was no longer alive, but hopefully having a conclusion to the case will allow Stacy's family to heal and move on. 1. Donald Cox Jr. Fawn Cox was brutally strangled to death on July 26, 1989 in Kansas City, Missouri. The 16-year-old had been working at her amusement park job until 11 p.m. that night, and when she got home, she went straight to bed. Fawn's lifeless body was discovered by her little sister and mother the next morning, when they went to see why she wasn't turning off her alarm. According to the girl's family, they didn't hear anything out of the ordinary on the night of her murder, likely because the sound of the air conditioner drowned out all other noise. But Fawn's sister, Felisa, did remember the family's dog acting strange that evening, but they just thought it was because she was pregnant at the time. Sergeant Ben Caldwell from the Kansas City Police Department told KCTV News that to pick that home and that window to come in and leave undetected makes sense that the subject knew Fawn. And based on his statements, anyone who knew Fawn personally was a possible suspect. But even then, the case was unsolved for 31 years. But in the summer of 2020, new advanced DNA technology allowed investigators to test DNA collected at the crime scene. And after completing genealogy testing, Fawn's killer was determined to be Donald Cox Jr., the girl's own cousin. Unfortunately, justice would never fully be served, since Donald died under suspicious circumstances in 2006. Even though Fawn's family will never get to see her murderer go to jail, they're able to have some closure now that they know what happened all those years ago. If you found out one of your parents helped cover up a murder, would you report them to the police right away, or would you tell them to turn themselves in? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.